have children's church this morning, so they are welcome to join their teachers and go downstairs at this time. See you, kids. So for the rest of us, as I was thinking about how to start the sermon today, I knew we were going to be talking about conflict, and I was like, a pithy story would be great, and I had nothing for you. So sorry about that. We're going to just jump right in. One of the reasons this topic came up, and I've been thinking about it a lot, is I've encountered it quite a bit in my work as a psychologist. And also, I've been thinking a lot about where our church has come since we were working with Pastor Todd, and we've grown so much in this area. And I'm just so happy for us. I'm so happy that we've learned so much about how to be in better relationship with each other. And I hope that what I have to share with you today just gives us a few more tools in the toolbox. Okay, so last week, Pastor William was talking about the commandments, specifically the 10 commandments that focus on our relationship with each other. And managing conflict is such an important part of seeking the good of other people, right? He kept talking about how we need to seek the good of other people, and that is really what was underlying those commandments. That's the desire underneath it, is what is the good for other people. And living in conflict with other people doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's so toxic for a relationship that we have to figure it out, especially when we're close to each other. The closer we are, the more key it is that we just figure it out. So we need to get to a place where we can understand and appreciate the needs of other people. And that way we can actually find a compromise that works for both parties. So I hope that by the time we're finished the sermon today, you will feel more relaxed, not stressed by this topic, and that you will feel that you have more options for working through the natural ruptures that happen in relationship and see them as opportunities, not relationship killers. We need to be able to discern when to invest energy in to repair a relationship and when to move away. So today we're going to look at 3 different Bible stories: the story of Abraham and Lot, the conflict between David and Nabal, and the story of Jesus and his mother after she lost him for 3 days in the temple when he was 12 years old. Each of these conflicts is different and needed to be resolved in different ways. And I hope these stories can be a bit of a lens for you when you're confronted with a particular kind of conflict, to help you determine what kind of response would be most useful in that particular situation. So first of all, let's start with, what is our instinctive reaction to conflict? There's 2 not very useful responses that often happen when we're facing a conflict. We either retreat and don't have the conversations that we need to have, and this tends to lead to resentment. Resentment kills relationships. It just does. We can't carry around grudges and think that we're going to have rich, meaningful relationships. Resentment is a slow poison, and so avoidance just doesn't work. And the other response is to come in too hot and blow the other party out of the water, and that does not work either. So neither of these is a great reaction, but there's a reason why we do them, and that is because it's actually related to our fight or flight reactions. The fight, flight, or freeze reactions are what we do when we encounter a stressor that's kind of too big for us. This is you see a bear in the woods. What are you going to do? Are you going to try to fight it? Are you going to run away? Or are you going to play dead? And so as psychologists, we call this being in a reactive state. You're not thinking about things, you're just responding, and it's like a survival instinct. So when we're dealing with people in our lives, and we treat them as though they are a threat to us, as though they are the bear in the woods, it's pretty hard on the relationship because the other person doesn't want to be seen as the bear. They want to work through a problem. And each one of us tends to have a go-to reaction. If you're a fighter, you'll tend to respond to conflict as a fighter. If you're a freezer, that's going to be what you will normally respond to the conflict with. But different kinds of conflicts are best addressed in different ways. And we should have a point of having several different reactions available to us. So that way, when we're confronted with a rupture in a relationship, we don't go into a reactive state. We can take a breath and decide which one do we want to use? What response do we want to use. I tell my patients that if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If you only have one form of reaction and you respond to all conflict the same way, it's probably not going to work well. More tools are better. Although, personally, I pretty much just have a hammer in my toolbox. But anyway, I understand that other people who are better at handyman stuff have more tools. Anyway, instead of being reactive in the face of stress, we're better able to arrive at compromise that both sides can live with and even be happy with. So some of you may say, well, Talitha, I don't really have conflicts. But it's important to understand that ruptures and repairs are a normal part of a relationship. If you never disagree with another person that you are in a close relationship with, then one of you is faking it. Some relationships are more peaceful overall because both parties have worked through and learned how to be responsive to the other person and listen well and react well. They've practiced the rupture and repair pattern. And so some relationships go along more smoothly than others. Also, some relationships have more similarities in terms of their values, their goals, their personality, and their relationship styles. But even in happy relationships, there are times of closeness and times of distance. And that's just part of being in honest and genuine relationships. So let's talk about a few causes of conflict. There are 3 separate things that normal, good people have legitimate disagreement about, and that can lead to interpersonal conflict. They are the following. They are values, their goals, and personality types. So let's start with values. Values are the deeply held beliefs that motivate us. Two types of values that I frequently see leading to conflict in my patients' lives I think of them as justice and relationships. So some people are very motivated by a desire for fairness and justice. And then the relationship side is that some people are very motivated by maintaining strong relational bonds. And so a key question that I often ask them is your focus more on doing things the right way, or is it about maintaining the relationship? So in the DISC assessments that some of you guys did with Pastor Todd last fall, you might have noticed that the C's and the D's were more task-related people, were more task-focused people, and the S's and the I's were more people-focused people. And that's another way of thinking about the same kind of conflict, right? Are you orientated towards doing things right and getting it done, or are you more orientated towards keeping that relationship? And so neither one of these is wrong. They're just different orientations. In fact, you need to hold them in balance. An interesting thing about value conflict is that the situation gets worse the more extreme you hold any one value. If you run over people because you are right, that causes a lot of conflict. If you don't have rules or boundaries because you care so much about maintaining relationships, that causes a whole set of conflicts for another reason. So values are both deeply held. They're very important, but they have to be held in balance and with a certain amount of flexibility to the other person's perspective. Another example of values are the ones that this church has chosen. You can find them on our bulletin. They are relationships, biblical teaching, and spiritual growth. And it's very helpful for our teams, the core teams, to have those to refer back to because they keep us focused on the things that we hold in common. Our core teams are based on these values. And using them as the basis for our ministry makes sure that we're not going off in some direction that isn't in keeping with the heart of where our church is at. Okay, moving on to the next thing. Goals are things that we do. So values are the core beliefs that provide us direction, and the goals are the specific ways in which we work those values out. So goals flow out of our values. And in our church, for example, this would be the specific choices that our core teams make about the way the ministries run and what they choose to do. Which community members to care for, which educational groups to focus on, what upgrades to make to the church. So if we don't share values, then our goals become mismatched and at odds with each other because goals and values are connected. So if you find yourself not agreeing with someone about a particular goal, it's possible that the actual underlying value is also not shared. So it can be a really interesting conversation to step back and try to understand what's going on underneath. For instance, if someone feels very strongly about running a particular event or group and that doesn't fit with our stated vision, it can be very interesting to ask them what they're hoping to accomplish. And sometimes you can start to see what their underlying value is. So once you know it, it also often provides natural steps forward. If you figure out the value, now the goal naturally flows out of it. Either the person might choose to fit into a particular team that's also working on something similar, or they might choose to pursue it independently, and that's what Pastor Todd referred to as passion projects. And there is room in the church for both of these things, but it's worth a conversation to find out why is the conflict happening, and is there a value underneath that isn't quite shared, or is the goal just being expressed in different ways? So you can see that working out the shared goals are an important part of managing conflict. And then personality is the last issue. Personality is the unique makeup of each of us as individuals. So many of you did the DISC assessment with Todd, and in the transition team, we found it was actually very helpful to create our core teams in our ministries using the different personality types. So if it's been a while since you've gone over this, or if you've joined since we talked about this, I'll just run over it quickly. The Ds are the really task-orientated people. The Is are the ones who care deeply about relationship. S's care deeply about stability and having correct process. And C's are very interested in facts and data. So you think, well, let's put all those in a team and see how that goes. And you'd think it would be terrible, but it's actually great. The different kinds of personalities, when you can manage the different perspectives, provide a lot of strength to each other. They help us accomplish a lot, and they help us avoid blind spots. I happen to know that on my team, Tamara is like the opposite personality for me, and she's wonderful at pointing out to me when I'm going too hard or too fast, or I'm going to run over someone, because I have a bit of a D side to me, and she has an S side, so she's going to be like, no, well, maybe we should rephrase that, Talitha. And she's right. It's a really wonderful strength to have the balance to yourself and recognize it for what it is. In order to be able to do that, we have to understand each other, and we need to understand how to have the conversation to manage the conflict. Okay, so let's look at how values, goals, and personality relate to each other. It's very important to share values. That's why we did that whole work of putting all the stickies up on the sheets and talking things through, and then pulling the information out of there and putting it into the statements and running that past the church and making sure that everyone is on board with those core values. It's really important. Different goals might emerge, especially for the different teams. The different personalities may want to express those values in different ways, and that's all good. Because we can always go back to the shared values and look at those and make sure that we're in step with each other, even if we're expressing them in different ways. For instance, the outreach team is orientated towards noticing needs in our community. And the relationship team is orientated towards providing space for everyone to thrive here in our church, inside of our community. And sometimes the events that we do might tilt more to one goal than the other, but they should all relate back to the values. And finally, we should expect to have different personalities. We're all different, and the perspectives all need to be represented. In this church, the values are the things we share, the goals we sometimes share, and personalities are always different. So with that little bit of an introduction and framework, let's look at these three stories of the conflict and how the situation was resolved. So we'll start with Abram and Lot. I call this one conflict that needs space. At this point, Abraham was still called Abram, and he was following God's call into Canaan. So if you could put up Genesis 13, that would be great. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at the time. So Abram said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plains and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The Lord said to Abraham after Lot had parted from him, "Look around from where you are, to the north and south, to the east and west, all the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So what can we learn from this story? There was conflict. There was not enough room for everyone to have their legitimate needs met. Abram didn't ask Lot to change. He didn't expect the herders to get along when there was a legitimate cause for disagreement. In this case, the situation was the problem, not the people. There might have been underlying differences in values, and Lot and Abram made different choices about their lives, and they went in different directions. But what they needed at that moment was actually space. So sometimes we just need to change the situation. Everyone needs a little more elbow room. Sometimes there are core value differences that are leading people to want to make different goals, and maybe being in the same ministry team isn't a good choice at that point because people are pulling in different directions. But this is often one of the most straightforward solutions to conflict, and the key thing is to recognize that the needs of both parties are legitimate, and they're not likely to change. And the thing that we really need to remember is that neither person should be resentful in this situation. Just give each other space. Later, when Abraham finds out that Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be destroyed, he doesn't bring up Lot's choice to go to the beautiful plain of Jordan or suggest that he was foolish for doing so. He was able to accept God's blessing in the place that he had ended up and to wish Lot well. Though in the end it didn't turn out particularly well for Lot, the values that motivated him didn't lead him to make good choices in terms of where he lived. So here are the three key points about Abram and Lot in this type of conflict. Sometimes we all need space. We can make space for each other without holding resentment against the other person. And we can let other people have different values and goals and understand that this may take them in a different direction than the one we choose. And we can give each other space to be different. Okay, so the next story, David and Nabal, is not quite as simple. I call it conflicts with a Nabal. It could also be called conflicts with a fool, but the word fool is a very heavy one, and I believe it should be used cautiously. In this story, that's what Abigail calls Nabal, and there's very specific reasons she chooses to do so. So let's start reading at the beginning of 1 Samuel, chapter 25. Here, David is living in the wilderness with his mighty men, his band of warriors, trying to avoid King Saul, who wants to kill him. He wants to kill David so that David won't become the next king. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his home in Ramah. Then David moved down into the desert of Paran. A certain man in Maon, who had property there in Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. He was a Calebite. While David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. So he sent 10 young men and said to them, "Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favorable towards my men, since we come at a festival time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them.' When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. Nabal answered David's servants, 'Who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their master these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men who come from who knows where?' David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. David said to his men, 'Each of you strap on your sword.' So they did. And David strapped on his as well. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Day and night they were afield around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He's such a wicked man that no one can talk to him." Abigail acted quickly. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. Then she told her servants, "Go on ahead, I'll follow you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there was David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. David had just said, "It's been useless. All my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "Pardon your servant, my lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent. And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal. And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my lord, be given to the men who follow you. Please forgive your servant's presumption. The Lord my God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my lord will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. When the Lord has fulfilled for my lord every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or having avenged himself. And when the Lord your God has brought my lord success, remember your servant." David said to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day, and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, who kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would be left alive by daybreak." Then David accepted from her hand what she brought him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request." When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house, holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk, so she told him nothing at all until daybreak. Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise be to the Lord who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servants from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." So at the beginning of the sermon, I was talking about conflicts that relate to personality. And one of the most common assessments that we use for understanding personality in psychology is called the Big Five, or OCEAN, and it stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And each of these personality types exists on a spectrum, such as extroversion versus introversion, and each of us tend to fall somewhere on the spectrum. We're not 100% extroverted or 100% introverted. And they aren't inherently positive or negative characteristics. They're just different types of personality. But there's some personality types that don't really fit into that description of the OCEAN description. And they're called the dark triad. And there's been some very interesting research done into these personality types that are sort of an aberration from what is normal and healthy. And the dark triad are psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. They sound terrible, and they are. I tell my patients when they describe encountering people who have these characteristics that they actually need to think of them differently than they do most of the people they meet. Most people are OCEAN people, and the dark triad people are an entirely different thing. They make me think of that verse that we are supposed to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. We don't need to beat these people at their game, but we need to understand what their game is, because otherwise they will hurt us and they will exploit us. That's characteristic of these personality types. So let me just talk a little bit about what each one of them is. Psychopathy is characterized by a lack of empathy and remorse. If this person hurts you, they don't care. They think you're a sucker for letting you get away with it. And it's actually in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Manual for Psychology, it's close to the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. And this is a very common diagnosis for people who are engaged in criminal behavior. So a lack of empathy and a lack of remorse are very much key red flags when you're thinking about that personality type. Machiavellianism describes people who trick or deceive people for their own ends or to accomplish their own goals. They use people. You might recognize the name Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote the book called The Prince. It was used to ingratiate himself to the Prince of Florence at the time, who was Lorenzo de' Medici. And this was written about 1513. There was a lot of conflict. At the time, Italy was divided up into lots of little tiny kingdoms, and there was a lot of jockeying for power within this. And so Machiavelli he'd been actually expelled from the kingdom, and he was trying to win his way back into the court. So he wrote up this book, which was a handbook for maintaining power. And key themes in the book are things like, it's better to be feared than to be loved, the ends justifies the means, and that maintaining appearances is actually more important than being morally good. So there's nothing really about that position that aligns with Scripture. It certainly doesn't align with the principles of loving other people and seeking their good, like William was talking about last week. This personality type is about using people instrumentally, using people to get what you want. And then the last trait, narcissism, is excessive self-regard and arrogance. Grandiosity is another word that's often used to describe this kind of personality. And in its malignant form, these people feel that they're justified in being abusive if they're not treated with the special treatment that they're entitled to. It's also a very toxic thing, very much the pride, right? I'm entitled to all of this. So you can see how this dark triad is a very different thing than the ocean personality types. You might find, that I talked about before, so you might find someone to get along with, hard to get along with because they are very extroverted and you're quiet, or you're conscientious and care deeply about finishing tasks properly and the other person seems less focused than you. Like, these are normal conflicts that, as ocean people, we encounter with each other. But there's a very key difference. These are the kinds of differences that you can understand and make room for or talk through and find a solution. When you encounter someone who has the characteristics of the dark triad, those solutions just don't work. There's certain reasons why the dark triad personality types are self-reinforcing. Generally speaking, if you want to break out of that, you have to be humble. You have to walk back against the very push of the personality type. And those kinds of people almost never want to. They never want to, a narcissist does not want to become humble. That's the thing they're most fighting against, is having to be realistic about how they are not special, they're just like everyone else. They won't do it, and they will run you over before they will do it. So the incentive to change is backwards with this kind of thing, and it's like that verse, it's harder for the camel to get through an eye of a needle, right? You have to do that thing that you most don't want to do to get to a place where you actually need to be. And because of that incentive structure, these personality types are very resistant to change. So with this kind of framework in mind, let's go back to the story of Nabal. When Nabal receives a very reasonable request, he responds harshly. He says, "Who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their master these days. Why should I take my bread and water and meat that I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men coming from who knows where?" If you make a reasonable request from another person and they respond with a character assassination, there is very little hope for a future relationship with this person. Because, you see, David wasn't a runaway servant. He had been anointed by Samuel as the future king of Israel. He had been protecting Nabal's herds and shepherds. He had been kind. And the servants pointed this out. These men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us the whole time we were in the fields. Near them, nothing went missing. Day and night, they were a wall around us. But then they say about Nabal, he is such a wicked man, no one can talk to him. There is that resistance to change there. What we see about Nabal is that he's lacking in empathy, honesty, gratitude. He's willing to use and exploit other people. He doesn't listen or learn from other people. He parties like a king, which is that bit of a narcissism there, while refusing to share with people who have been kind to him. These all look like characteristics of the dark triad. The Nabal type of person is very distressing to deal with. When I talk to clients who have these kinds of people in their lives, they're often very angry. They're hurt, they're confused. Like David's response, sometimes they meet this disrespect and injustice with violence, or they're inclined to. Sometimes they're just in disbelief at the behavior of another person, or they feel like they've caused it. And they almost never know how to handle the situation. There's something very disorientating about the relationship. They may be like David, ready to meet fire with fire, so they may be having a fight reaction, but sometimes they also have a totally different one, and that is that they are frozen. They have no idea how to proceed. They're simply doing nothing, and the Nabal in the situation is completely running the situation. So these type of people, the Nabals, will distract us from focusing on the thing that God is calling us to do. They will leave us feeling enraged and exhausted, stunned and hurt, like we're responsible for the situation in some confusing way that we don't quite understand. They derail us, and they love chaos, because chaos allows them to do the thing that they want to get away with. So how do we deal with conflict with this type of people? And Abigail provides a beautiful response. Please pay no attention, my lord, to that wicked man Nabal. This is in verse 25. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And now, my Lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my Lord be like Nabal. And in verse 30, when the Lord has fulfilled for my Lord every good thing he has promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my Lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or having avenged himself. So Nabal wasn't really David's responsibility. He was just a horrible person that David had encountered. David was called to be king, and as Abigail pointed out, inflicting justice on Nabal was only going to result in a burdened conscience at a future time. It's God's job to judge these people, not ours. We don't have to label them as fools, but if they match up with the characteristics of someone who is deceitful, who doesn't learn from their mistakes, who blames others rather than changing, who is indifferent or enjoys the distress of others, who is arrogant and chaotic, then we should notice the red flags, and we should create space between ourselves and them. There's very little, if anything, we can do to help, and it's usually not our job to punish. They will experience the consequences of their behavior, just like Nabal did, and we want to be far out of the line of fire when that happens. You don't want to be caught up in what's coming their way, because the natural consequences of this kind of behavior is very harsh. So when we encounter conflict with a Nabal, here's a few things to think about. Understand that this is a different kind of personality than what you encounter in most relationships, and you need to be far away from it. Look for the red flags of lack of empathy and deceitfulness, rage and control, using people, grandiosity. They're often very chaotic people, and recognize that they're unlikely to change. Understanding them or being kinder to them will likely not result in a change in the behavior. They're more likely to take advantage of you and see your kindness as weakness. Don't let them distract you or take you away from the things you're called to do. Move away from them and allow God to judge them in his own time. Okay, so the last story. Conflict that requires curiosity. And this is one that I really love. This is a different kind of conflict. This is one in which you frequently share values. You're just differing on the goals. And these are the relationships that you want very much to repair. You want to be close in the long run. This kind of conflict may still cause us to go into a fight or flight state, but it's important to notice that this is happening and to slow down and to think about two words. Two words that I think about so often with this are humility and curiosity. Slow down and take a breath and become curious. The story we're going to use for this illustration is the conflict between Mary and Jesus when he was 12 years old. Joseph's also present, but the conversation is actually between Mary and Jesus. And those are the people whose words are actually recorded. So let's read it from Luke 2, 41 to 52. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they didn't understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them, but his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and favor with God and man. So in this story, Jesus and Joseph have been searching for Jesus. Mary and Joseph have been searching for Jesus for 3 days, and they are quite stressed by the time they find him. This is an understandable reaction. If I lost my son for 3 days, I would be stressed. But as parents, we have this preoccupation from the time our children are born to keep them physically safe. But as children grow into their teen years, they naturally seek out greater freedom. At 12, Jesus was now no longer considered a child. This was the first year he was going to this festival, no longer a child. This must have been a pretty exciting trip for him, because there were implications within that culture to being considered not a child anymore. And it would seem that Jesus took this very seriously, because he went out and he sought out the leaders and the scholars. But Mary and Joseph weren't quite seeing him the same way. In the story, Jesus seems puzzled as to why they didn't come looking for him at the temple. If you look at this from Mary and Joseph's perspective, they looked for Jesus everywhere that you would expect a 12-year-old boy to be. They had likely gone to the marketplace, which in the Middle East is quite a chaotic and fascinating place. Normally a place you might find a 12-year-old boy hanging out, having fun. They probably looked for him with other 12-year-old boys who were, maybe playing games or with anyone they might have known in the community. Undoubtedly, they asked anyone who might have known him if they'd seen him. These are all logical places for a 12-year-old boy to be. But Jesus isn't just a 12-year-old boy. Jesus is the Son of God who's been living through the experience of being God in human form for 12 years. If you think about this from the perspective of Jesus, it makes a lot of sense that he went to the temple. Jesus was trying to figure out how to be human and God. That's a hard thing for people to even imagine who have studied it deeply. How, as a 12-year-old boy, would you possibly figure out how to do this mission that he's beginning to feel the pull towards? So, of course, he goes and he looks for people who are knowledgeable, people who devoted their lives to understanding how do we relate to God? What do we know about God? The religious leaders would be naturally very interesting to him. Why, indeed, would he be any other place than where he could learn about this? So we can see here that expectations are causing a problem. His parents are expecting him to act like a 12-year-old boy that they are familiar with, but that's not an accurate picture of who Jesus is. Jesus is behaving as the Son of Man who's trying to figure out how he can maintain a connection with his heavenly Father while being human. And it's the discrepancy between these two sets of assumptions that's actually causing the rupture of the relationship. So how did they repair this type of conflict? They weren't dealing with different values. They're dealing with different assumptions and different goals. Safety for Mary, and learning and growth for Jesus. This type of conflict is an opportunity for growth in the relationship and even deeper closeness, because we have the opportunity to get to know each other better through the conflict. The key to resolving this kind of conflict is humility and curiosity. Humble listening, asking good questions and listening carefully to try to understand the value that the other person is operating out of. Mary expresses her deep distress, and Jesus responds with "Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" It's kind of cool. She said, "Your father and I were looking for you." And he says, "I'm in my Father's house." He's pointing to a different father and reminding her that he isn't just her biological son. He has this other identity. This is a question that reveals a great deal about who he was, what mattered to him, his values. And Mary doesn't really understand this at the time, but she accepts the information and she treasures these things up in her heart. And Jesus goes home and grows in favor with God and man. So sometimes it takes time to understand the other person, and sometimes it takes several conversations. But in these situations, it's absolutely worthwhile to slow down, calm down if necessary, start to ask questions and to really listen. Listen to learn and not to just respond. Learn what the value is that the other person is operating out of. Learn what they're scared of or stressed by. Mary and Joseph did this, and we know this because of the outcome. The verse says, Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. They found those common values. In the big picture, I'm sure this is what they both wanted, his growth and favor with God and man. So in conclusion, sometimes in conflict, we make space for people to make different choices than what we would choose. We do it freely, and we don't resent them for it or rub it in their face if it goes wrong. And Abraham is a beautiful example of being gracious. In fact, being graciously right. Sometimes we encounter chaotic, angry, deceitful people who wish to use us. And in this case, we really just need to move away because none of us need Nabal in our life. And lastly, sometimes conflict is an invitation to understand each other better, to notice our assumptions and values, and to learn about other people's. When we approach these types of conflict with humility and curiosity, we can often find a path forward, like Mary and Jesus did. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for this church. I thank you for the journey that you've brought us on. I thank you for the place that you're going to take us to. I'm just so grateful to be able to be part of this community, and I pray that you will continue to guide us, provide us wisdom in our next steps, and hold our hearts close to each other and to you. Amen.